Hi guys, so I know I've been posting a lot about low back pain prehab, so exercises that you can do if you have low back pain or to prevent low back pain, but I thought it would be really helpful to come on and actually give you a little bit of information about the mechanics of your low back. How does it work? Why does the hip girdle actually involve the back? So let's take a little bit of a rundown. I know I mentioned earlier that we've got different components to the spine, and certain things should be stable, certain things should be mobile. So in our necks, starting at the very top, we have 7 cervical vertebrae, and so those are the vertebrae that form our neck. And we think of our neck as a really, really mobile area. We've got a lot of range of motion here, but because it's so mobile, it actually can end up becoming too mobile, and that can be a problem. So it's really important for that part of our spine to be stable. Moving down into the mid-back, that's our thoracic spine. We've got 12 vertebrae there. Those are the vertebrae that have ribs attaching to them. And so that's actually an area that can be really stiff for us. You know, we end up seeing that kind of round posture when we sit, have a hard time really opening up. So that's a really important area to be mobile. Moving into lumbar spine, we have 5 vertebrae down here, and those tend to be really mobile. And that's why we end up getting back pain, because we get so much mobility here, and it can actually end up compensating and causing pain. Down the chain, we've got obviously our hip girdle, and our hips tend to be a little bit tight, even though that should be a really mobile area for us. So we want the hip girdle to be mobile. The knees need to be stable, right? So we think about ACL tears, that sort of thing. That's a joint that needs to be really stable. Ankle needs to be mobile, and then the foot needs to be stable. We'll talk a little bit more about the lower chain in future posts, but let's really focus on the areas above and below the lumbar spine. So again, thoracic spine, hip girdle tend to get really, really tight. And so when that happens, all of the movement comes from this area that has all this extra mobility. So we go to forward bend, and look what happens. We end up moving too much through here. So what I want to talk a little bit about is how we should be hip hinging, how we need to be moving, because one of the things that we do all day, every day is bend forward, right? And so I know myself personally, the very first thing that I want to do when I go to pick something off the floor is, I round to my thoracic spine. My hips don't do a lot of the movement. All that movement ends up coming from rounding to our lumbar spine. And why that's a problem is that it causes undue stress on the areas between each of our vertebrae, so our discs. We've got a little bit of an image here. You'll have to forgive my terrible artwork. So the intervertebral discs sit between each of our vertebrae, and they kind of act as a little bit of a cushion. This, I don't know if you can see very well, demonstrates a disc bulge. And a disc bulge isn't typically something that happens with trauma. It happens with repeated overuse, working the wrong way over and over again. So I sometimes like the analogy of shoes, right? So if you tend to walk on the outside of your feet, you're gonna wear down the outsides of your shoes. If you are consistently not bracing through your lumbar spine, you're gonna overuse that disc. And as you bend forward, these vertebrae are gonna pinch from the front. And so you can imagine this is gonna get pushed to the back. So again, my terrible drawing, this is a bird's eye view looking down at the disc. So this area right here is the vertebrae itself. Here is the disc. So the disc is comprised of the annulus, and those are these rings that are really pretty strong. And what can happen is that we can develop an annular tear, so a tear in these fibers. The inside of the disc, the nucleus, can then end up herniating outward, and it makes contact with the nerve as it leaves the spine. So that's what causes pain. And you can imagine that continuing to press forward on this area and pinching here is going to squeeze that nucleus out the back and continue to perpetuate that pain you're feeling. So if you're somebody that has an annular tear or herniation, the really good news is that these things heal, but you have to let them heal. So one of the biggest things that I see in my patients is that we get their symptoms under control, and it's great and they feel better, but then they go right back to moving in the way that hurt them in the first place. I know that I am super guilty of this. So I'm gonna finish by just giving you a little bit of feedback in terms of something that you can be practicing to maintain a neutral spine. This is something that is appropriate for everybody, no matter if you're acutely injured or this is something you've been dealing with for a really long time. I'm not saying that you always need to live in neutral spine, but it is so important to at least gain the mobility through your hip girdle and your thoracic spine so that you're able to keep that lumbar spine neutral. And like I said, of course, as your pain gets better controlled, you do need to be able to move through your pelvic girdle and your lumbar spine. You need to be able to flex, you need to be able to extend. But until your pain is controlled, you need to be able to maintain that neutral spine. So what that means for you is, can you find a place where you can move your low back? A lot of people that end up with herniated discs get this flattening and this tilt to kind of try to protect, because you don't want to be pressing that material posteriorly, and that opens the space up in the back. So here's the cue that I love to give people, or the exercise rather, is to take something, maybe a broom, and as you stand here, it should be making contact with the back of your head, in between your shoulder blades and on your sacrum. As you bend forward, if you're maintaining appropriate alignment, you're sending your hips back, your weight is in your heels, and you're still making contact with your low back. That whole rather is making contact with your head, your low back, and your sacrum. So you should be able to hinge here. So the movement is coming from all components of that chain. It's not just happening from our lumbar spine. Watch what happens when I'm not hinging. It leaves my low back. So we don't want to be bending forward like this. You can see what just happened to my hip. So that is a sign that we're flexing through our lumbar spine, and that is not what we want to accomplish. So again, if you're having a hard time with that, sometimes it's really beneficial to actually put your hands on your hips. Give yourself a little bit of overpressure to send those hips back. Of course, if you're really tight through your hips, your hamstrings are tight, your piriformis is tight, you're gonna have a really hard time doing that. So we'll talk a little bit more in future posts about how to keep your hips really mobile, how to keep your thoracic spine really mobile so that this guy can stay stable. In the meantime, I hope that that's a helpful exercise for you guys to get started trying to find that neutral spine. Really think about it all the time. When you're sitting, when you're standing, you know, we should be able to hold ourselves in neutral, because that's going to be preventative against injuries in the future. Thanks so much, guys.